Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the new mini-series on the podcast, The Judean Revolt, with Professor Guy Rogers, about the Jewish war against the Romans and the subsequent Churban Beis HaMikdash. The series is based on his new book, For the Freedom of Zion, The Great Revolt of Jews Against the Romans, 66 to 74 CE, and is focused on a purely historical look at what happened based on classical sources, mainly being Josephus and others. So it's not a hashkafic or Chazal-based discussion. It's purely historical. And the discussion starts with Herod, Hordus, and goes through the lead up to the war, the actual war, the Churban, the aftermath, ending with Masada. I would like to thank the sponsor of the series, AlephBeta.org. As we begin the 3 weeks, to help you prepare for Tisha B'Av, I encourage you to check out Aleph Beta's collection of Tisha B'Av videos. Rabbi David Fohrman, who is the founder of Aleph Beta and who was a guest on the podcast, for those interested in learning about his methodology and why he does cartoon videos for Torah, you can check out that episode. And his videos explore some of the most beloved Tisha B'Av texts to discover the deeper meaning and relevance of the day. And for listeners of the podcast, for a limited time only, you can get an $18 off an annual Aleph Beta membership, which will give you access to all the Tisha B'Av videos, plus hundreds more on Parsha and the other holidays. All you need to do is go to alephbeta.org. That's ALEPHBETA.org, and enter coupon code SFARIM22 when you check out. And this information will be in the show's notes as well, so there'll be a link there. You can check this out. And as always, if anyone has any questions, comments, or feedback, or would like to support the show or sponsor an episode, please check out the website, svarimchatter.com, or email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Guy Rogers, who is the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Classics and History at Wellesley College. And he has just written a new book, quite a large book, called For the Freedom of Zion, The Great Revolt of Jews Against Romans, 66 to 74 CE. And this is the first episode in a planned mini-series on the book, which is, like I said, it's about 450, 500 pages plus appendices, so it ends up running around 700 pages and goes from the beginning, kind of we'll talk about when the beginning was, through the end of the war, and then the unfortunate Churban, the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, of the temple, and so we'll be discussing that. So with that, thank you, Professor Rogers, for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I come from Connecticut. I went to the University of Pennsylvania as an undergraduate, studied classics and political theory there. And then I did a second degree at University College London in the late 1970s, and then came back to the United States and did my PhD in classics and ancient history at Princeton, which I finished by the mid-1980s. And then actually the job at Wellesley was the very first job I ever applied for. And oddly enough, I got the job. And so I've been teaching there essentially ever since.
So now you write this book on Jewish history. In your previous books, I think you have a book on Alexander the Great and others. I mean, how did you end up in this particular topic interested in Jewish history and specifically?
So when I was doing that second degree at University College London, I enrolled in a undergraduate seminar taught by the late Sir Fergus Millar, the title of which was The Early Rise of Christianity in Its Historical Context. And it turned out that it wasn't really a seminar at all about Christianity. It was a seminar about the Acts of the Apostles, and also about this author called Josephus, whom I knew about Josephus a little bit, but I never really read him in detail. So I took this seminar, and it really implanted a kind of passion for this material in me. And one of the things about my experience was that for those of your listeners who have read a little bit of Josephus, especially what we call the war, only a few pages in, you realize that there's kind of a level of detail about this area or region in the Roman Empire, which you just can't find for any other place in the first century CE. So I realized that this was an incredibly rich text. Of course, lots and lots of people had written about Josephus. Josephus sort of underwent a renaissance in the late 1970s through the 80s and 90s. A lot of scholars became interested in him as an author. As you said, I had other things that I was working on as well. But, very broadly speaking, the kind of two vectors of my research have been Greco-Roman religion and also military history. So in a way, the revolt brings those together in a kind of perfect storm of interest for me.
Right. And as we'll get to, I'm sure, throughout this episode and this miniseries, you do have both those in the book, and in the appendices and throughout it in the book, you very much talk about military and tactics, which make it also very interesting, and how much food the army needed. You give specific numbers and estimates, which is, very, really fascinating, what happened. So, one final question on this before we dive into the material is, why did you decide to write a book on this? I mean, we should also tell the listeners right at the beginning that the book is basically it's almost like a retelling of Josephus or retelling of the war. And this is something that has kind of been done. I mean, why did you decide to write this book, and what is unique about this book as opposed to others?
So what happened was in the late 1990s, Fergus Millar, who has written extensively about Jewish history, asked me and a scholar at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem named Hannah Cotton to be the editors of his collected papers. And so from the late 1990s into 2006, 2008 or so, I was reading all of these essays, and I began to realize that the scholarship about the revolt had kind of moved into some directions, which I found to be a little bit strange. So in particular, I sort of discovered that there was very little interest in the revolt as a war in and of itself. Meaning there was scholarship about the causes, but not about what happened during the war and why one side won and the other side lost. And coming from my scholarly background, where I'd written a lot about Greco-Roman warfare, I thought that there was a lot more to say about the tactics and the logistics and the strategies of these sides to explain the outcome of the war. And then, of course, the lessons that could be drawn from it. And just to sort of summarize it, I think ever since the time of Josephus, Josephus kind of put his imprint on the interpretation of the war itself, even though scholars disagree about a lot of his details. And his imprint is and was that the defeat of the Jews in this war was inevitable, that they were going to lose no matter what. And so what's really different about my book is I argue that that is not true. In fact, it can't be true because nothing is inevitable in war and warfare. And so starting out from that premise, I then went back and looked very, very carefully and tried to extract from Josephus's account and other sources as well what we can about what actually happened during the war and why the Romans prevailed and what it led to. So I do think everybody that reads this book, the reviewers by and large thus far, have all sort of fastened onto this thread about how the Romans fought the war, how the Jews fought the war, and how those different approaches help us to understand what occurred and, in a sense, allow us to get out of the Josephus paradigm for understanding this conflict.
Right, and absolutely, that's hopefully what we will be able to discuss over this mini series. Is that we'll be discussing, like I said, the someone who reads this book can get an understanding and find out what happened in the war from beginning to end if they don't know, and as well as the reasons, and that's something we hope to discuss as well. Now, I want to just kind of disclaimer is that we're not kind of discussing theologically, hashkafically, and Chazal. That's not what the point of this conversation is. We're more discussing, historical sources, historically what happened, and like you said, why it happened historically, and just historical reasons alone, nothing more. So, interestingly, you start the book with Herod, Hordus, as people know him with, Herod the Great. So just why, I don't know if you want to just first mention the Hasmonean dynasty, the Chashmonaim. It's something that Josephus starts his work with, but you did not start with. So kind of two-part question. Why didn't you start there? And just maybe give a brief overview up to Herod for the listeners so we can start there.
Right. So the original version of this book actually started not with the Hasmoneans, but in fact with Alexander the Great, kind of intruding into this area in 332 and fundamentally sort of changing the dynamic of this region. And in the aftermath of Alexander, of course, these two very powerful dynasties were Greco-Macedonian dynasties were sort of set in place, the Seleucids in what they called Syria, and then the Ptolemies in Egypt. And that sort of put Judea in the middle of these military dynasties. And so the first version of this book had 300 or 400 pages from 332 BCE down to the time of Herod the Great. And this book is 744 pages long. I didn't have a lot of takers for an 1,100 page book, and so what I decided to do was to sort of make the book about the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and the Jews, and then the Hasmoneans. And then the first sort of Roman contact, the serious contact under Pompey, into a kind of prequel for this book. All of that said, there are lots of parallels and ways in which both the Greco-Roman intrusion and then the Hasmonean history kind of are set up either analogies or processes which are directly influential over the story I tell. But the way I choose to deal with that material in this, the second book, as it were, which is the first, is to kind of look back at them, for instance, with the issue under the Hasmoneans of the unification of both secular and also religious power which goes on under the Hasmoneans, that's something that Herod the Great avoided. And then also a much more important issue in some ways, what happens when Greeks and Macedonians begin to settle in and develop towns in this region, sometimes coming into places where the majority population were either Jews or what people whom Josephus calls Syrians. So all of that is part of the story, but at some point you have to kind of make a choice about where you start. Some people said to me with that prequel that I should have started actually with the Persian period, so the pre-Greek period as well. So at some point you have to choose. So my choice was Herod, and the reason why, the intellectual justification for starting my book with Herod is that Herod is incredibly interesting. I think he is the most. It's one of the things I discovered in writing this book, that Herod may be the most interesting individual of the early Roman Empire. He's just an incredibly fascinating figure. And then for my purposes in this book, Herod kind of exemplifies, both personally and also in his policies, this sort of central issue, which ultimately is vital to the story of how and why the war broke out, which was whether it is possible in Herod's world to be both a Jew and a Roman. Obviously, I'm sure that some of your listeners will know that there was a guy named Yeshua, or Jesus, whose answer to that was, you could render unto Caesar what's Caesar's and render unto God what is God's. But there were people who didn't believe that. And so actually the first, I'd say, 150 pages of the book is really about how Herod's answer to that question, which was that you could be both a Roman and a Jew, increasingly became a minority position among Jews. So that by the time we get to 66, there was a kind of threshold of people who didn't believe that that was either possible or desirable. And until you get to that point, you really don't have a revolt. So that's why in the first substantive chapter of the book, there's so much about Herod there.
Right, and let's dive into Herod. I mean, listeners may be somewhat familiar with him as Hordes, and he appears in all over, obviously, Chazal, but he, in the Gemara, but we should talk a little, obviously you talk about him in depth. Like you said, he was a very interesting figure, vicious as well. And let's talk about him, when he was born, where he was born, where he was from, his Jewish kind of descent. He was a Dumain. What was, how was he Jewish, and talk about some of that.
Right. So Herod was born in 73 BCE, and his father was Idumaean. He came from, south of Jerusalem, a guy named Antipater II. Antipater had kind of made a name for himself originally as a supporter of the kind of famous Roman general Pompey. But later he became a supporter of Julius Caesar, and in fact, sort of saved Julius Caesar when Julius Caesar was in Egypt trying to resolve a kind of messy dynastic issue there. And so he was rewarded for that. And in 47, he was made what they called a procurator, which is a kind of Roman administrative position in the region of Judea. And his young son, Herod, was made into the governor of the Galilee. So Herod's father was Idumaean. His mother, interestingly, was a Nabatean Arab woman named Kipros. So he came from kind of a mixed background. But his father was an important local ruler. In 40 BCE, Herod was made king of the Jews by the Roman Senate and essentially given rule over the area of the Galilee and what's called the Pariah to the east of the Jordan River, and Etruria, which is the region in southern Syria. And it took him 2 or 3 years to kind of establish his rule. Essentially, what he had to do was to fight it out with the guy who was being supported by the Parthians, who were the other big kind of superpower in the region during this time period, a sort of Iranian dynasty. So they supported this guy, Antigonus to Mattathias. And in 37, actually with the help and backing of Caesar's right-hand man, Mark Antony, finally, Herod was able to establish his rule over the kingdom that the Roman Senate had given him in 40. So he sort of hitched his wagon to a series of important Romans, first Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony. And then after Mark Antony was defeated by Octavian during the Roman civil wars at the Battle of Actium in 31, Herod, just like his father, Antipater, who went from Pompey to Caesar, Herod turned around and became kind of the best and most loyal friend of this guy, Octavian. And actually, that kind of put in place this huge opportunity for Herod and his kingdom to be both militarily secure, but also for Herod to kind of exercise all of his talents. So there's no doubt that Herod was a ruthless and at times brutal ruler, especially in cases where he thought that family members of his were kind of plotting against him or threatening him. But at the same time, Herod, I think, is arguably the most important civic benefactor in the Eastern Mediterranean during the late 1st century BCE. And also, of course, within his own kingdom, left his kind of stone signatures everywhere on the ground. I think for your listeners, it's important in the case of his kingdom, just to kind of note that Herod seemed to have kind of a strategy within the kingdom, which was in places where Gentiles, non-Jews, were in the majority, he had no problem sort of subsidizing, paying for the construction of sort of standard Greco-Roman type buildings like theaters and amphitheaters and gymnasia and things like that. But where Jews were in the majority, he had a different kind of strategy. So just if you take the two, there are, in my book, I talk about all of the Eastern Mediterranean benefactions and the ones in his kingdom as well. If you look at the two most important examples, the first, of course, would be kind of Caesarea, which he started sort of remaking in around 22 or so. And the renovations and constructions went on there for more than a decade. And so Caesarea was a place where we're pretty sure that the majority of people there at the time were either Greeks or what Josephus calls Syrians. There's a lot of discussion about exactly what that means. There was a sizable minority of Jews there. But in Caesarea, for instance, Herod had constructed a temple that was dedicated to Augustus and to the personification of Rome, so Roma. But on the other hand, there was at least one synagogue and probably more in Caesarea as well. So that's a place with a mixed population in it. But of course, what Herod's great claim to fame was the reconstruction of the Temple Mount. And I go into a lot of detail about that in my book. So I'll just mention a couple of things about that. The first thing is just about the scale of it, which I'm sure that a lot of your listeners have been to Israel, been to Jerusalem, gone to the Western Wall. So some people have a sense of a little bit of the building. But one of the things I do in my book is just to bring out some comparative material. So for instance, it's important to realize that the Herodian renovation of the Temple Mount ended up covering an area of 35 acres. 35 acres. So on a comparative scale, what that means is that the base of the Temple Mount was 3 times as large as the base of the Great Pyramid at Giza in Egypt. So the biggest pyramid in Egypt, it was 3 times as large in its base. And twice as large as the predecessor that was actually, worked on during the Hasmonean period as well. And of course, the work on it went on into the first century CE, well into the first century. So there's a lot of evidence for that in Josephus, but of course, a lot of archaeological evidence and ongoing excavations there as well. So you asked me at the beginning about part of my impetus for writing this book. So without going into too much politically at this point, it's really important to emphasize, I think, and to, in a non-aggressive way, to make sure that everybody understands that indeed there was a huge renovated and beautiful Temple Mount with several buildings, including a renovated temple on that spot as a result of Herod's actions. There is no doubt about that.
Absolutely. And yeah. And I want to, obviously listeners are probably familiar with this. The Gemara in Baba Basra says, Misha lo'ira binyan hordis lo'ira binyan nam yamav. Anyone who didn't see the building of Hordis never saw a beautiful building in his life. And I think you mentioned in the book this, there's always, we have the 7 wonders of the world. It really should have been definitely really 8 wonders of the world, as you point out in your book. And this is something that, like you said, you can still see, part of today, and how amazing that, was. Obviously we can't see most of it, but unfortunately, as we'll get to talking about as we get to the book, but the little bit you still see. So there's a couple of things to unpack about Herod. Obviously, there's much more in the book. We're not going to go in depth. You want to go, in depth. It's in the book. You talk about the relationship with Mark Antony, with Octavian, who becomes Augustus, the Roman emperors, and his relationship, and it being, his political, I guess, acumen, knowing when to flip sides and that kind of thing. But we should pick up a little bit more. I think probably to emphasize, also his, I called it earlier his vicious side. His, I think you call it, Herod the Horrible at one point. There's an interesting quote on page 20 in the book, about Herod's pig, and you attribute this, I think, to Augustus, saying that it was better to be Herod's pig than his son, and which you kind of explained because if he kept kosher, a pig he can't eat, so it wouldn't kill the pig, but everybody else he could kill. His kids, he killed his wife, he killed his kids. So talk a little bit about who he was killing. He was killing everyone. He was suspicious of everybody, and maybe that, although you do, I think, also point out that maybe kind of allowed things to stay calm in the region during his reign. Oddly enough, as it sounds, he was killing everybody. Right. So Josephus is kind of unsparing in his account of all of the family members that Herod either had executed or exiled or fought with throughout actually right until the very end of his life. And, the 2 examples that people always talk about are, of course, his execution of his Hasmonean wife, Mariamne, who was the granddaughter of Hyrcanus II, who was executed for adultery. And Josephus goes out of his way to say that she was innocent. She was not guilty. I don't know. I don't think anyone really knows about that. But of course, it kind of put a mark next to Herod's name. And then that was in 29 BCE. And then in 7, her sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, were also executed, strangled in Sebaste, which was one of those cities with a majority of Gentiles in it, for plotting to kill Herod. Actually, in the case of Alexander and Aristobulus, there's pretty good indications that they were plotting against him. So, not everyone that Herod either had put on trial and or executed were, goody two-shoes. I'm not trying to justify his brutality. I'm just saying that as with the evidence throughout my book, what I do is I try to look at everything on a case-by-case basis and not, I don't have a unified field theory, as it were, of Josephus's view of individual members of the Herodian family. I try to look at all of the evidence and make inferences based upon it. But so I don't think that there's any doubt that Augustus hit upon something with that quotation, which we know about from a late 4th century Roman source called Macrobius. But
I think it's also important to realize that that Augustus himself had family problems too. So this was not kind of an unusual phenomenon in the ancient world. And if you just look a little bit to the east, over at the Ptolemies and the Ptolemaic dynasty, similar things were going on at the same time.
Okay, then just finally, and also relates to the vicious brutality part. His brutality was the Herod's death. Talk about when he died, and then what he wanted to happen upon his death.
Right. So when he knew that that he was going to die, he had all these horrible maladies, and he was pretty sure that he was going to die, and so he had a bunch of his enemies sort of rounded up, and he had ordered his sister Salome to have them all executed when he died, because he knew that when he died there would be a lot of people who would celebrate, and so he wanted everyone to be sad, which is kind of a typical Herodian touch, as it were. But when he died, his sister disobeyed his wishes and let everyone go. And so he didn't get his last wish, but oddly enough, perhaps because everyone knew that he was going to be succeeded by one of his children, one of his sons, everyone behaved pretty well during his funeral celebration or memorial, and people kind of paid him respect afterward. And he ended up being buried in Herodium or Herodion, which is a place that has been very thoroughly excavated. There's sort of some scholarly controversy. Some scholars think that he wasn't interred there. I think the vast majority of scholars believe that, in fact, he was interred there. And basically, I end my chapter about Herod by kind of pointing out that while you could have kind of a mixed view of Herod and his reign, in hindsight, given what happened after his death in 4 BCE, over the next few decades, there was a huge amount of turmoil in Judea and in the regions around Judea, leading to the outbreak of the revolt in 66, which brought about these horrible consequences for the majority of Jews. So I don't want to say that Herod's reign was a golden era, but I guess that I would just want to remind people that, Herod didn't have full independence. He was one player in a very difficult world. And so.
Yeah, and there's a lot more on Herod in the book, obviously, on all his other building projects, as you mentioned, and Masada and other things that we didn't get to. So that's the next chapter going forward. We're not going to get every chapter, every part, but just kind of, speaking broadly, if the listener wants to purchase the book, which I will put a link in the show's notes. Even though it's 750 pages, Yale University Press, I think I forgot to say it's Yale University Press, and a hardcover, as of this recording on Amazon, is about $26, and even list price, I think it's like $45. So it's very affordable and very readable. I found it. So for the listeners now, continuing on, you then go to the succession of Herod and his son Archelaus, I think if pronounced right, and then what you call the Little Revolt that happens in 4 BC. So, like you said, even if but in Herod's time, not that Herod was a good guy, he wasn't, but there was this kind of stability in some senses that already right after his death just kind of is not the case.
Right. So, in fact, there was a kind of struggle over the succession, in part because Herod made out 6 or 7 wills, or actually sort of changed his will 6 or 7 times. But the final version of it, essentially named Archelaus as the heir, and so, of course, what that meant was that Archelaus, if he was going to take on the job, it had to be sort of ratified by Augustus. So Archelaus with his supporters went to Rome, and the anti-Archelaus crowd also went to Rome, and they sort of argued it out before the emperor. And in the end, Augustus decided not, as it were, to give Archelaus Herod's entire kingdom. And I think that what he did was he made him gave him the title of ethnarch, which means essentially, it's from a Greek word, ethnarches, which means the leader of a people. And I think that what Augustus was trying to do was essentially make him into the people of Judea, and then the places around it where Jews were in a majority. But he specifically lopped off from Herod's much bigger kingdom the places where Greeks or Syrians were in a majority. And I take it that the reason why he did that was that he anticipated that there would be agitation and problems between the Jews and the non-Jews in these towns and these cities. So as I put it in my book, he gave him kind of a starter kingdom, except it wasn't a kingdom, it was an ethnarchy. And it turned out that Augustus didn't sort of last as the number one guy in the Roman world for 40 years plus by accident. He was onto something. He knew something, because Archelaus really only lasted as a stabilizer, which is what you had to be in his position, for a little under a decade. And finally, both Jews and Samaritans who were within his ethnarchia went as kind of an embassy to Augustus and said that he was completely intolerable and that they had to get rid of him, which he did. And so he was sent away into retirement in 6 CE. And that really is a point of change in this world. Because to this point in time, the idea was that the Romans were going to try to rule with and through members of this family, which had managed to kind of seize control of the state under Antipater and his son Herod. And now they were kind of out, and Augustus and his advisors decided that they would instead send out a Roman governor with the title of praefectus or prefect, who would essentially be the person who had jurisdiction over this area. And what that jurisdiction entailed was the ability, finally, to exercise capital jurisdiction. So these were people who were in charge of keeping the peace and making sure that a tribute would be collected and paid, but also could intervene in cases when, according to their judgment, public safety or security was under threat, and they could have people executed. So that is the new arrangement. And there's a controversy among Roman historians about this, whether this really means that at this point we should call Judea a province, or the Latin word provincia. I happen to be among those who think that that it is a province right at this point, very probably, because the original kind of semantic force of the word provincia is a sphere of jurisdiction. When we talk about provinces, we think of, places, but that's not the original Roman sense or Latin sense of the word. It means what it is that somebody can or cannot do. So I think that it is a provincia. It's a place where these prefects can do those things that I was talking about. But it's it's under the watchful eye of another Roman administrator sitting 100 miles or so to the north in Syria, a person called a legatus, a legate. A legatus is somebody who is chosen specifically by the emperor himself. And the reason why the Roman emperors chose the legates, especially of places like Syria, is that Syria had a boundary, as it were, with the Parthians, they were kind of the main strategic threat in this region. So the Syrian legate is up there in command of Roman legions, and then down in Judea and that area, there is a praefectus who's kind of the man on the spot in the core of where Herod's former kingdom was.
Okay, so a lot of information there, and in the book, again, it's much more in depth. And obviously, anyone who's familiar with this time, Josephus, especially in this time period, there's a lot of names and a lot of material. We don't want to be too dense here. So in your the chapter, you discuss more the little revolt, as you call it, and there's more in there explaining what happens upon Herod's death. So we'll leave it for the book. And then you already explained what chapter 3 is entitled From Ethnarchy to Province, and what exactly happens. And you discuss as well the various early governors of the area. Something that is, important to mention is what the governors, especially the early governors at this time, what their relationship with the Jews were, how they treated them.
Right. So, I think it's worth saying that even with the first governor, this guy Coponius, the first governor was sent out, and immediately what happened was the Romans decided that they would do a census in the area, which meant counting the people, of course, but also doing a kind of property census as well. And there was resistance to that immediately, led by these two guys, a guy from the Galilee called Judas, and then a Pharisee called Zadok. So right from the start of the imposition of the jurisdiction of the prefix, there was resistance. And we know from other sources that the resistance wasn't just a few people, that there were a lot of followers of Judas the Galilean and Zadok. So eventually that was sort of beaten down, as it were. But I think it's a really important point because it's going to connect to what we're going to talk about next time when we talk about the outbreak of the revolt itself. As far as the rest of the governors in the period from 6 to 66 are concerned, I think that there's kind of a fundamental point to realize about Roman rule in general. When we talk about Roman legates and Roman prefects and there are other titles, procurators and lots of others as well, sometimes people get caught up in the all of the titles and the organization of the administration itself. But I think you have to realize that this was behind that administrative structure, essentially a system of personal power. That's what what we call the Roman Empire was. When we talk about the Roman Empire, usually people start with Octavian / Augustus, who, after the end of the Roman civil wars, after the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, emerges as kind of the last guy standing and takes on all these titles like imperator, which means kind of conqueror. It's where we get the word emperor from. But in fact, that's just a facade. The reality, which was recognized by Roman historians like Tacitus, was that this was a monarchy. And who the monarch is and what the attitude of the monarch is toward the Jews and their status in the Roman Empire is crucial, of course, to the experiences that Jews have. So in our region that we're talking about, between 6 and 66, some of the people, some of the governors, for instance, the legates of Syria, like this guy Vitellius or Publius Petronius, when the Roman emperor Gaius or Caligula, whose reign was from 37 to 41, had the idea, a brilliant idea, of having a statue of himself put into the temple. When he had that brilliant idea, this guy, Petronius, recognized, you know what? This is going to cause a war. Have you realized that? So first he sort of played along with that. And then when he realized, when, thousands and thousands of Jews sort of came to him and said, we'll do anything that you want, but if you do that, people are going to lay down their lives to stop this blasphemy. Petronius found a way essentially to stall until Caligula was assassinated, which saved them from having to save them actually from a war breaking out. And it's one of the reasons why throughout my book, I argue essentially for historical contingency and the choices that people make. On the other hand, we have our friend, the praefectus, our prefect, Pontius Pilate, who's probably the most famous prefect of all of them in the period from 6 to 66. So Pontius Pilate is an incredibly interesting figure, of course, for world history, because it's very likely that in April of 33, he was the one who signed off on, gave the order, using his capital jurisdiction that I was talking about before, for the execution of this guy, Yeshua, or Jesus. He was the one. And I could talk a lot about that and how and why it's very likely that he was the one who gave that order. But that's a topic for a different podcast. But what a lot of people don't realize is that Pontius Pilate probably was better known in Judea and kind of more controversial for other things that he did. For instance, his attempt to bring these sort of gilded shields into Jerusalem, which had on them inscriptions, apparently, that made reference to the deification of both Julius Caesar and also the Emperor Augustus. It's very likely that Pontius Pilate was praefectus from 26 to 36 CE. So Augustus is dead and Julius Caesar is long dead, and both of them were deified after they died. So, bringing shields into Jerusalem, which mention the deification of people who clearly had been mortals, was a big problem for people. Another big problem was that he also, apparently with some cooperation from some Jewish officials, attempted to or allowed the bringing in of these sort of standards or placards which were carried by Roman legions into the city as well. And on those, there were representations, usually the way it worked, whether it was a Roman legion or an auxiliary force. And it was mainly an auxiliary force, a kind of, a locally recruited militia which served with or alongside of the Roman legions. Those military standards had on them depictions, representations of the living Roman emperor at the time. So again, of course, it was a not something which would have been allowed because of the rule against graven images. So there were a lot of things that Pontius Pilate and other later Roman governors did, which kind of inflamed sensitivities in Jerusalem and also elsewhere. So the real answer to your question is that, excuse me, some of the governors seem to have gone out of their way to try to understand the local context. And some of them, like Pontius Pilate, probably understood something about the local context, but then made choices or decisions that meant that they were going to alienate or anger groups there. So.
Okay, so following this, we come to Agrippa. Agrippa I, or Agrippus, as people may know him as so he becomes king after this. So this is the fourth chapter. So perhaps want to talk a little bit about him.
Right. So he was so what happened was after a lot of trouble from 6 to 44, the Romans decided that they would 6 to 41. I'm sorry. they decided that they would go back, as it were, to the Herodian model, that it wasn't working sending out these prefects. They would let somebody who was part of the Herodian family have a go at being Rome's man on the spot again. So the guy selected was this grandson of Herod the Great, the son actually of Aristobulus IV, the young guy who was executed in 7 BCE. As a kid, Agrippa I had been, when his father was executed, he'd been brought to Rome. So he was kind of Roman raised up and educated, knew people who were part of the Roman imperial, the inner family of the Julio-Claudians, and in particular was a friend of Gaius / Caligula. And so, in fact, in 36, he was put in prison by the Emperor Tiberius because when he was out, on like a chariot ride, out cruising in a chariot with Caligula, he happened to express his desire that Caligula should be the emperor instead of Tiberius because he was better at everything. And it was reported to Tiberius, and so Tiberius put him in jail. So when Tiberius died in 37, and Gaius, Caligula, succeeded him, Caligula took Agrippa I out of jail and gave him a kind of a starter. It wasn't really a kingdom, but he became a king of a tetrarchy in the north. So he didn't start out, as it were, as a successor to Herod's kingdom. That came actually under Claudius. So Claudius, after the assassination of Caligula, added what had been the core of Herod's kingdom, so Judea and Samaritus, to Agrippa's kingdom. So basically by 41, we were back to where we were, or almost back to where we were during the time period of Herod the Great. That is, a member of the Herodian family in charge of the core kingdom. And, Agrippa I started to do the things that Herod and the good Herodians did, which was to, endow buildings and things like that, try to take care of the poor in Jerusalem and all of that. Unfortunately, Agrippa I had a very short reign. We don't know exactly what he died of, but he died in 44 in Caesarea. And I think you can get some purchase on what the issues were when you recognize that after his death, the militia soldiers who had been serving under him, most of whom were recruited in the towns and cities that were non-Jewish majority, sort of celebrated his death. So he hadn't really managed to effectively sort of straddle the ethnic tensions in the way that Herod himself had. And so they kind of celebrated and rioted. And at that point, the Emperor Claudius realized that they still had this problem of ethnic conflict. And they began to send out another set of governors who are called procurators. There's more controversy about exactly what the status of Judea was at this point. The Roman historian Tacitus says that at this point, that Judea was added to the province of Syria. Josephus in the war tells us that that the emperors reduced the kingdom to an eparchia, which has to mean a province. Later, in his much bigger book, The Antiquities, he seems to imply, or the Archaeologica, he seems to imply that that its status was more either in between or under Syria. And there's a huge scholarly controversy about it, which we can't go into right now. But in any case, now from 44 to 66, we have these procurators being sent out who, again, have that jurisdiction that I was talking about before, but who increasingly see their job as extracting the maximum amount of revenue from the people that they are the procurators over. And that becomes a huge issue after 64 CE, the date of the big fire in Rome, when a large section of the city of Rome burned down, and the Emperor Nero suddenly needed vast resources to help to rebuild the city of Rome. And that kind of leads us into the immediate period before the outbreak of the revolt itself.
So this leads us to, and we'll pick up in a second here, of chapter 6, the fuse, and what happens with Florus. But just for the listeners, obviously we're skimming a lot here because it can get dense, and we don't want on a podcast to be extremely dense. But in the book, right, you do discuss in chapter 4 and 5, you discuss all, in chapter 5, let's say the procurators, each of them were, as like a subtitling in the chapter, and you go through their actions and who appointed them and what happened in what was happening with the Jews in Judea, and you do discuss all that. So there's a lot of detail with a lot of figures, a lot of people, and there's a lot going on in there throughout. The only thing I want to mention that we didn't, before we get to Florus, and just to put a pause here so everyone will get to, he's the procurator in 64, but before that, one thing we didn't mention that you do mention a bunch of times is the Sicarii, daggermen, and they're going to come up all over, and they already come up here early, and then they keep coming up. So maybe we should mention them. I realize we didn't discuss them because they're kind of important.
Right, sure. So the Sicarius means dagger man, and there are some ancient historians who believe or argue that the Sicarii, which is the plural, that they're a phenomenon of the early 60s. Leading up to the outbreak of the revolt in 66. And so that may be right, but it's also worth pointing out that when Josephus is talking about the transition from Archelaus's rule, which ends in 6 CE, to the jurisdiction of the praefectuses, the prefects, that he talks about these people who go around attacking people who side with the Romans. Remember, I mentioned that there were leaders, these guys Judas and Zadok, who led this resistance to the imposition of a census. Later on, when Josephus is talking about the Sicarii in the context of the 60s, he goes back to 6 and he says, at that time, tota gar in Greek, meaning at that time, there were these Sicarii as well. At least that's my reading of it as well. So he sees the antecedents of these people earlier in the first century. And these are people who attack both Romans, but also Jews, whom they consider to side with the Romans. So the Sicarii become a major group of activists, players in the period just before the outbreak of the revolt itself.
Okay, yeah. So like I said, there's a lot more details that we are mentioning, but I wanted to point that one out. So
sure.
Now getting back to chapter 6, which is the final chapter of part 1. So the last thing we'll discuss in this episode is Florus, the procurator, and what his actions were and how that kind of lit the fuse, as you say, for what would become the revolt, the war.
Right. So my book, in some sense, begins with this story about a sacrifice that a Greek guy, Hellene, made in front of the synagogue, or one of the synagogues in Caesarea. And the Jews in Caesarea saw this as a provocation, which undoubtedly it was. And they tried to get the Roman governor at the time, this guy Florus, to intervene and to put a stop to it. In fact, they offered either to buy kind of the workshops that were being built in front of the synagogue, and or they offered a bribe, which in fact the governor took, a large bribe. But then he didn't do anything about it. And when this sacrifice of these birds was made in front of the synagogue, when nobody would intervene, that led to rioting in Caesarea between Greeks and Jews and Syrians. And actually, that in and of itself was probably not a point at which a revolt was inevitable. But what happened was, after the Roman governor failed to intervene, the news of what happened there made its way, of course, to Jerusalem. And so people were aware of that. And then Florus, under pressure, undoubtedly from Nero, decided that he would take a large amount of money from the temple treasury. Some historians believe that what he was doing was he was taking arrears, money that was owed of the tribute. Other scholars think no, that this was something that he just did on his own. But in any case, he took a large amount of money from the temple treasury, something like 17 talents, I think, large amount of money. And as a result of that, there was rioting in Jerusalem. And so at that point, the governor unleashed upon these rioters the local group of soldiers who were stationed in this fortress building, which overlooked the Temple Mount compound, called the Antonia. And they massacred a large number of them. We don't really know how many of them they massacred, but they killed a large group of civilians. And after that happened, there was kind of quiet in the city for a day or so. And Florus ordered another group of soldiers to come to Jerusalem to sort of reinforce the soldiers. And it had been kind of a typical practice for Jews from the city of Jerusalem to go out and to greet and to meet the soldiers who were making their way into the city to salute them. So kind of a polite salute. And Florus had ordered his soldiers that if there were any signs of any trouble at all, to attack them. So they attacked them, and there was a second massacre, an even bigger massacre outside of Jerusalem. And then when the civilian population tried to come back into the city, within the city itself, and Florus then unleashed the combined militias on part of the city, part of the upper city. So there were two large massacres of civilians in the city in the spring of 66. And in my book, what I argue is that this is really the beginning of the war itself. And part of the reason why I argue that it sort of comes out of my understanding and writing about warfare in other contexts in the ancient world. I mean, so the ancient world was a world where warfare was endemic. You can't understand the ancient world if you don't understand that warfare, for unfortunately too many people, was considered to be sort of the natural state of affairs. But when you have a situation where thousands of civilians are massacred at the order of the power that is supposed to secure this area, my own argument is that pushed over onto the sort of non-accommodational or non-Roman side tens of thousands of people, because we're talking about people's brothers and sisters and husbands and wives and children. Once that happens, once there's blood on a massive scale like that, that changes everything. And people do not forgive and forget things like that very easily. So that's why I call this really, that's the lighting of the fuse itself. We can argue about interethnic tensions and, interpretation of the law and who should be in charge of the high priest robes and things like that. All of that, we can still argue about those things and we can have conflict about them. But once you massacre a bunch of civilians outside and inside of Jerusalem, the gloves come off.
Right, and that's something we'll pick up in the next episode with what happens next and how that becomes a full-blown revolt. The one final just general question that I think we'll ask here, just because it's the first episode, it's worth discussing, is your main sources, obviously Josephus, but who are your other sources? And regarding Josephus, how reliable or unreliable he is and how you address that throughout the book.
So Josephus, at the beginning of our discussion in this podcast, we were talking about who Josephus was and, how Josephus scholarship has sort of changed from the 1970s until today. And, in some ways, the way I work with Josephus is a reaction to the trajectory of scholarship, because many scholars, I think, have come to this point where they kind of consider Josephus to be just another sort of Greco-Roman rhetorician. And I don't think, first of all, that's important. And I think understanding Josephus's rhetorical objectives and agenda is really, really important. But more important is the war itself and how and why the temple was destroyed. The facts, the events are more important. So what I do with Josephus is I look at everything on kind of a case-by-case basis, and I look at all the evidence. And so I'll just give you a quick micro example. So as people are reading through Josephus gives us a lot of figures. He'll tell us that after a battle, 20,000 people died. Or he tells us at the end of the war that 97,000 people were enslaved. I think that when you're talking about large, sort of rounded off figures, that we should be skeptical about those figures. But he also gives us very exact figures as well, 15, 18. So I think that's the dilemma with Josephus, and that's why I have this case-by-case approach. Another example, he tells us that at Yodfat, that where he was the general and surrendered and went over to the Roman side, that there are cliffs around it. There are not cliffs around the site of Yodfat. It's steep, but they're not cliffs, okay? So he exaggerates, and it's our job to understand why he exaggerates. All of that said, Josephus is indispensable for this story, this war, and we use other sources and archaeology to try to do our best to check what he has to tell us. So I'm not willing to throw Josephus out, as it were, with the bathwater. Josephus is a hugely important reporter about events and people and the situation in the Eastern Roman Empire during the first century. Hugely important.
Okay, so that does it, I guess, for this episode of the series, the first part of the book. And like I said before, I will link in the show's notes to the book where people can purchase it. Like I mentioned, on Amazon, it's a little cheaper as of now. There's also Yale University Press directly, and other places as well. So until the next episode, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure. Take care.